Greetings. This is a story that is going to unfold over 4 different charts that I'm going to show you. 3 topics within those 4 charts, but 4 charts because the middle 2 charts are actually the same data represented in 2 different ways. And this has to do with the US real estate market. It is not a worldwide oriented video. It's pretty much going to be more of interest to those who are interested in the US real estate market. But as this is a very large piece of the US economy, which is a large piece of the global economy, this could have a negative effect on other economies in the world, even though seemingly all real estate is local. Not from a financial side it isn't, because the mortgage and the securitization of real estate has diffused the risk as well as upside of real estate investment substantially. So we go to this first chart, which is from Calculated Risk blog, and this is the number of housing units under construction in the United States. Red is 1 unit, single family homes, and blue are 2+ unit structures. So everything from a 2-unit duplex up to an apartment tower that has 200 units in it. And you can see the total, if you add both of them up, is at the highest point it has ever been since 1973, so the highest point in nearly 50 years. The red, it was still recovering from the housing bust of 2007-2008, but the recent QE, which the Federal Reserve does in a very narrow way, as I often say, they buy mortgage-backed securities when they should be sending cash directly to people. This benefits homeowners, but it does not benefit people who don't own a home, and it benefits the wealthiest homeowners more than the small-time homeowners, unfortunately. So that shot up because of the quantitative easing due to COVID, and the end of quantitative easing and the increase of interest rates from the Federal Reserve could bring this back down, which would be negative for the U.S. economy. But the number of housing units that are in buildings of 2 or more units, which is to say apartments, condos, duplexes, and things like that, was rising long before that. The quantitative easing that the Federal Reserve has had to do in response to COVID had a much smaller impact on this. It increased it more, but since it's not as governed by interest rates and mortgage rates, it did not rise that much, but it was already kind of high. It was higher than it was at any point since 1973. Now, if you add these two in combination, there's 1.6 million housing units under construction in the United States, and like I said, that is almost a 50-year high. During the bottom of the bust, you had only 400,000 or so units under construction. Now 4 times as many are under construction. And while the single-family home unit construction is not as high as the absolute peak of 2007 or so, although it's pretty high, the blue line is much higher. So the grand total is substantially higher than it was in the peak of 2007. Now, population has grown a little bit, but at the same time, that isn't that big of a factor because the U.S. population growth rate is shrinking substantially, and a lot of young people aren't forming their own households either. They still stay with their parents into their 20s or 30s for a variety of reasons. So the number of housing units under construction is at a near 50-year high, and it shot up recently because of the latest wave of U.S. quantitative easing, which is reaching a supersaturation point. This was chart number 1. Now we go to chart number 2. This is also from Calculated Risk blog. The article will be in the description box below. This is dollar spending of construction. Now this is not adjusted in terms of a percentage of GDP, so a gently rising line does not mean construction is becoming a larger portion of the economy. But the steep rise, however, is noteworthy. The Zoom telework revolution, which I often speak about in many videos on this channel, has permanently increased the supply of office space throughout the United States and throughout most of the advanced economies of the world, because more and more people can work from home. There's some professions that cannot work from home, such as a surgeon, etc. But any desk-based profession can ultimately work from home between 50 and 100% of the time. And the average turns out to be around 80, and I have many videos on this channel about that, tracking data in terms of Bay Area highway traffic, New York City subway traffic, and so forth. So this non-residential, which is to say commercial office buildings and things like that, is not going to rise that much anymore in terms of dollar spending. There is a tremendous oversupply of office space. So the only 2 areas in which the construction industry can still grow is public, which is government spending on buildings, and that includes roads and bridges and things like that. And that's gently rising, but it never has these sharp peaks and troughs. It can only rise slowly, staying at a constant percentage of the economy, because again, this vertical axis is in nominal dollars. It's not inflation adjusted or GDP adjusted. So the only area outside of government spending where the construction industry can grow at all is in residential housing construction, and that is very high. The dollar peak is way more than the peak of 2006. Smaller as a percentage of the total economy, but just as we saw from the prior chart, the number of units under construction is at a 50-year high, and the U.S. demographic profile is also very different than 1973. That's when the population was very youthful. A large wave of people was reaching adulthood for the first time, and now that's not the case. The only net growth of population in the United States is from immigration, and are immigrants of the same income profile as the domestic Americans they're replacing. In some cases, yes, but on average, perhaps not, because skilled immigrants are a smaller proportion of immigrants relative to unskilled immigrants. So there aren't that many new buyers who can buy the $3 million homes and so forth. And as the quote at the start of this video revealed, anything that boosts the price of housing automatically triggers the supply of new housing construction. And some cities try to contain that, as we see from the zoning tax problem, which I discuss in this video over here. The telework revolution has adapted around this pernicious artificial scarcity created by zoning. If San Francisco or Palo Alto just does not want to build new housing, no matter how expensive it gets or how much available land there might be, well, people can telework and they can move 50, 100, 200, or 500 miles away even. So housing supply over 50 miles away or 100 miles away can in fact directly compete with housing in more expensive areas that are expensive only because of restrictions of new supply construction. So these two charts alone tell us that the number of units being constructed is already at a 50-year high, but then the construction industry can only grow by residential construction. If residential construction were to even moderate somewhat, then the construction industry itself cannot grow very much, and the U.S. economy cannot grow, because this is a substantial portion of the entire economy, 7 or 8% of the entire economy. So let's look at the percentage growth rate. If we say this is chart 2A, that is chart 2B. Go back to the calculated risk article and then click on this chart over here. This is the same chart that we just saw, but percentage growth rate. As you can see, non-residential, commercial, office space construction, it is crisscrossing zero. There's not growth in the amount of construction of this, and it will eventually be negative for a long time because office space is in a permanent glut. There was this big downturn because of COVID, but not in the residential market. And the residential market growth rate reached 30% for a short time only, but the fact that it's still in the teens a year later shows how much growth there was, which we saw from the steep trajectory in the absolute number in the prior chart. Even the peaks of 2006 and 7 didn't have this high of a year-over-year growth rate and didn't stay above 10% for much longer than this. So we're very quickly getting to the point of the amount of new construction is matching the amount of construction expansion before the deep housing bust. And getting out of that housing bust took quantitative easing, but the Federal Reserve is not enlightened enough to think of new ways of quantitative easing, because this treasury buying and mortgage-backed security buying is saturated, and they have too much ideological resistance towards sending cash directly to people, which is the only way out of this, because we've already seen 3 charts are on 2 different data sets that show how this market is very, very cornered. And now I'm going to show you a third.